Welcome to the first in our series of 2024 Lunch and Learns. It's really nice to see some returning faces as well as lots of new faces. As John mentioned, so this webinar will be recorded. So everyone that signed up for the webinar will get a copy of the recording. If you have questions or would like more information after the webinar is over, feel free to contact either John or I. Please enter any questions you have in the chat box, and we are set aside some time to look at those. When we're done, our trustee, Seth's event person, Bella, will be monitoring the chat box. And then if we don't get to your question, please feel free to email us. Today, we're going to be talking about tree fruits. My name is Melissa Bell. I'm the Center for Environmental Farming Systems liaison for research, outreach, and education. I'll let John introduce himself.
Yes, thank you. So my name is John Little. I am an agriculture and local foods extension agent in Durham County, typically with a focus on sustainable and regenerative agriculture, and generally, typically small scale farmers. So that's kind of the angle one of the angles that we present some of this information in. But yes, this is one we've been waiting on since fall of last year, and we had a lot of folks who called me on my intent to have tree fruit in my last fruit seminar, and the fact that I didn't follow through with that. So we have a whole webinar today to talk about tree fruit, and we're happy that everyone is here. Ready to roll?
Thank you. Yeah. So I'm going to talk for a couple of slides here, and then I'm going to hand it over to John, and he's going to talk to us about apples and peaches, and then I'll join back in. And let's see, we're going to be talking about figs, persimmons, and pears today, and apples and peaches. We're going to talk about variety selection based on your location and your production goals, site preparation and planting, fertilizing, pruning, plant maintenance, and then disease and pest control. Before we get started, I wanted to mention some basic needs of all fruiting trees and introduce some terms that you may not be familiar with. This information is from an excellent publication from the NC State Extension Master Gardener. That's the link there at the bottom. So talking about chilling hours. So chilling hours are something that is needed for all fruiting trees in order to bloom and set fruit. They need a certain number of winter hours below 45 degrees. Inadequate chilling hours can result in little or no fruit. And we're talking, 200 to 800 hours, which is 8 days up to a month. And we'll talk about more about chilling hours when we get to the specific different fruits that we're talking about. Air drainage applies to where on the landscape you're planting your tree. You want to avoid planting it in low spots called frost pockets, where the cold air will gather. So you want to plant on a higher ridge that's unobstructed so that the cold air can keep flowing downhill. Sunlight, we'll see that almost all fruiting trees need 6 hours of direct sunlight. Some can deal with more or less partial shade, but they all need 6 hours of direct sunlight. We're going to be planting in the late fall or early winter when everything's still dormant. Fruit trees are really sensitive to nutrients. Nutrient management is important, so you're going to want to do a soil test before you add any nutrients. We can't change our soils or our climate, so we want to choose the best cultivar for where we are, and that can help limit pesticide use. So like I mentioned this link to Master Gardener from NC State Extension. So now I'm going to turn it over to John, who's going to talk about apples.
Thank you, Melissa. So yeah, apples are a big one throughout much of the state, but even folks who aren't in regions where they really grow prolifically can still have some pretty good success with apple trees. So the things that Melissa mentioned, in regard to soil and the correct tree for the correct environment, those are going to be really big with any type of fruit tree, specifically because they're perennial plants and it's not something that you can dig up and try again next year. So that being said, some of the major general needs for a lot of the different types of apple trees that we might see around here. We'll go into it in greater depth shortly, but rootstocks and selecting the correct rootstock, which will kind of explain some of the botanical properties of what that means shortly. Um, but the size and the spacing of the orchard and the specific trees is going to be really dependent on what rootstocks you use. So, and what size trees that you want. Apples have just a ton of pests around here. So we do generally try to have a holistic and low chemical, if possible, management plan for a lot of the things that we work with. But chances are you're probably going to have to employ some type of regular spraying program or at least some type of integrated pest management. IPM has, many different factors that you can employ. So it's not necessarily a condemnation to having to use a ton of chemicals, but you might be prepared for that kind of thing if you're getting into apple farming. A big thing with apple trees and with many fruit trees, but apples and pears, which Melissa will be talking about pears shortly. There's a lot of commonalities, and thinning and pruning are going to be pretty big for ultimately like the highest quality, most abundant fruit possible. And as Melissa talked about a second ago, nighttime temperatures, cooler nighttime temperatures are really, really vital for apples. That's one of the reasons you don't see them where it's a lot hotter, excuse me. And I'll be speaking shortly to how some of these characteristics of the apple tree make it a little bit different and maybe a little bit more finicky than some of the other tree fruit that we work with. So let me move on and talk about let me see, some of the concerns that you might be dealing with when you are producing apples. So I mentioned the pesticides, and I mentioned that in comparison to some other tree fruit, but specifically insecticides, insect pests account for a lot of the problems with apples, specifically during, you know, spring. Well, I won't even just say spring, but I'll say generally during the fruit development period. That's when you're going to have to be really mindful and really strategic with when you are applying your potential insecticides. If you have any questions about that afterward, we're happy to point you towards some resources for options that might be a little bit less poisonous. One thing about apple trees that is not, pertaining to trees across the board is that cross-pollination is going to be necessary to some extent with all types of apple trees. There are some varieties that are marketed as, to where you won't necessarily need cross-pollination, but that's, realistically, it's really going to hinder the quality and the quantity of the fruit if you don't have a little bit. So be considerate of that. Try to not have a single variety monoculture of apple trees in your orchard. It's a good practice with a lot of different fruit. But as we mentioned, selection of rootstock, which type of rootstock you select is going to not just uh, uh, affect the size of the tree, but also the maturation and when you are going to be seeing fruit development. A lot of folks will use Golden Delicious for cross-pollination, specifically for that purpose. And kind of the bearing age, like the years of the life when the tree is going to start to bear fruit. That's a big one to tie to the rootstock as well. So let me move forward. I want to talk about the trees in their setting in an orchard. Um, so first off, the orientation is important in a garden as far as collecting sunlight, but more so with an orchard because it's a higher investment and bigger plants. So north to south is really going to kind of maximize that reach of the sunlight. But as Melissa mentioned earlier, specifically with apple trees and a couple of other trees in the same plant family, um, air drainage is going to be really important. a couple of degrees Fahrenheit can really make or break the success of an apple crop when it's really cold out. You know, if it's freezing temperatures, the difference between a cold, foggy cloud around your tree and, you know, that same cloud having drifted slightly lower in the field, you know, that likely will save a lot of your fruit. So sloped areas are good with a slight gradient. And then really the spacing of the trees, I'm going to keep coming back to the rootstock. You know, if you're using a dwarfing rootstock that promotes a smaller tree, you can put them closer together. I encourage you to be flexible and consider your options. Um, Let me move forward and talk about these rootstocks that I've been referencing quite a bit already. So there's going to be a few available types of roots. I can't even say that. There's many available types, but falling into within a few categories. They're fairly straightforward. Essentially, the rootstock is um, the rootstock is an opportunity to have that tree uh, interface with the growing environment in a more successful way. You know, you're um, splicing the roots of plants that might have some specific advantages, you know, in regard to the environment, in regard to resistances, with plants that will produce the ideal tasting fruit. So the impact of the rootstock is significant. Um, and we can talk about that, you know, at length if anyone has any questions later. But dwarfing rootstocks typically are going to make apple trees that aren't a whole lot bigger than 8 feet or so tall, but they're going to bear apples more quickly. So, you know, if you've got a long-term game plan for establishing an orchard, but you want to make some pies sooner than that, maybe you get a couple of dwarfing rootstocks in addition to your full-size rootstocks. Um, Fairly intuitively, semi-dwarfing produces a medium-sized tree, whereas non-dwarfing does not affect the overall size of the tree at maturity. Um, but again, some of these rootstocks might have nematode resistance. Some of them might be more adapted to specific soils or, you know, enable a quicker harvest. So I'll talk about this again shortly, but when you get trees from your nursery, it's a great practice to at least investigate the rootstocks a little bit if they are indeed using them. Um, Talk about a few varieties of apples. You know, this is an instance where, and I saw a few friendly faces in the audience who are involved with different Master Gardener programs, but this is where the horticultural side of things within Extension is really helpful and useful because there are quite a few varieties of apple trees that uh, you can get to grow in this region and nearby regions. And it's I don't want to call it an experiment, but it's fun to see you know, which varieties are going to thrive and be preferable within your local markets or just within your growing environment. A lot of these are great. I think I mentioned that Golden Delicious is good to keep a couple trees of just because they're so effective at promoting cross-pollination during that time of year. Let's see. I'll move forward. I want to talk about planting apple trees. The planting process can be, you know, many many plants or fruit trees have kind of commonalities in the maintenance from the planting to the pruning to things like that. But there are some unique elements with apple trees that I want to make sure I draw your attention to. You can plant apple trees, you know, during the cold season. You know, it's that you have kind of a fairly wide winter, or excuse me, a fairly wide window, but winter time is generally when trees are dormant and the soil temperatures are going to be really appropriate for good root development after that. Um, when you get the tree, you know, when you get your tree from your nursery, plant them as quickly as possible. Letting the roots dry out can be really detrimental to apple trees. I mentioned again, know what types of root stocks the nursery is using. But if you've got fresh, young, healthy trees and the soil temperatures are in the low 50s, that's, that's going to drive that plant to be as robust as possible, come springtime, whenever it's got a good opportunity to start its growth. So a big hole is important in planting an apple tree, um, as is, and this is across the board, not just apple trees, but if you've got any roots on that plant that you get from the nursery that are really long, or maybe there's just a couple of weird excessive roots, pruning them, trimming them to where they're kind of uniform with the rest of the roots is helpful in not creating a situation where that one root, maybe has a problem or creates a girdling effect, or something like that. So uniform roots, big hole, and then don't bury the graft union, because if you bury the plant below the graft union, but between the root stock and, well, I'll get to a picture shortly, but between the root stock and everything above the root stock, um, burying that spot below the soil essentially creates a connection between the life within the soil and the part of the tree that you don't want to be within the soil. You lose the advantages of the rootstock if you, bury below the graft union. The diagram that I'll show shortly will help explain that a little bit more. But like any other plant, once you've got your plant in the hole, then you backfill it and water it well, roughly an inch a week for about a year. But that certainly depends on where you are and how hot it is and things like that. So talk about pruning a little bit. I want to move, yeah, so moving on to pruning. Fruit trees are going to require some differences in maintenance strategies throughout their life cycle, unlike some other plants. So, the first year versus the third year, it's a little bit less subjective and a little bit more necessary to kind of change your tactics in order to have an ideally shaped and a structurally strong, final mature tree. So when you're in order to prune an apple tree, and I'm going to show a picture of, we'll call them like a whip, an unbranched tree. If that's what you're planting, it's a good idea to head them, do a heading cut, a pruning cut of the leader of the tree, to a little under 3 feet tall. Then essentially, once that tree begins to produce other branches within that first year, then you pick the best, biggest, strongest one and you make that your leader. We want to prune ideally for a central leader with apple trees, meaning one strong center. So not immediately, but before it's a year or so old, and some of the shoots have begun to grow, then it's a good idea to prune off all of the shoots within 4 or 5 inches of that selected leader, that main branch in diagram, or in section B of the top section. Um, don't have any shoots near it, and that will divert the energy, the growing energy of the plant more specifically to that leader that you're trying to establish. Then roughly a year down the road, that leader is going to be grown. A lot of the other branches are going to be grown, but then you want to head cut a terminal cut at the end of that leader, a couple of feet above the branch below it. If you do this several years in a row at roughly the same time, you can really, really influence the final shape of your tree. Not the final shape, they're constantly growing, but the mature shape and size. Um, a lot of pruning when the trees are little, or well, a little bit of pruning when the trees are little will save a lot of work, 10 years down the road. So be mindful of that, with apple trees. We do have a ton of good pruning workshops, and Extension has a really strong training and pruning fruit trees document that we use for a lot of things that you guys might be interested in. But let me slide forward one, just considering the life cycle of the plant. Like this is
Hey, John.
Yes,
I'm
yes.
so sorry to cut you off. Just before we get too far forward, there was a question in the chat about a couple slides ago. Don't know if you want to address that now or save it for the end. Just wanted to let you know.
What was the question? Typically we'll do the end, but I can tackle it quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jane asked what the purpose is of the inner stem on the graft. Is it yet a third type of apple tissue? And I think this was a couple slides back. I can bring it up at the end too
No,
if you
let's talk about it at the end, but
Okay.
realistically, the interstem is going to be not resistant to the problems that the rootstock is intended to be resistant to. That interstem is effectively treat it just like the scion, the top part of the tree. Even though it's below the graft union, it's still kind of like that gray area that I might not be inclined to plant up to that if I can help it. But we can talk about that more at the end if that's okay. And then so considering just considering this shape, it's I won't draw too much of attention to this at the moment. But the image on the right is what you might get from your nursery that you might have to make that heading cut at the top of. And the image on the left is just kind of a nice little synopsis of the time frame through pruning apples from early on to a couple years down the road. Um, Now that we've talked a bit about some of the more significant maintenance practices, I will talk a bit about disease. Again, apple trees and their kind of botanical similarities to pears, there are some commonalities, but diseases can be really problematic with apple trees. Managing for disease, and I'll also say that pests and pathogens, are really closely connected. When something has a disease problem, it might get a pest problem, or vice versa, or maybe the pests vector the disease, So we talked a lot about how diligent management of pests is important with apple trees, but so, that has a lot to do with disease as well. So most apple tree diseases are going to be fungi, which have a lot to do with temperature and moisture, and they certainly have a period of time in which they are most prevalent. So some of these diseases are a little more severe than others. Fire blight is bad. Summer rots are really bad. Some of these resistant varieties that I've listed below, which there's a few, that's not comprehensive, but that's a few good ones. They have resistances to things like mildew or scab, which is, apple scab. That's a picture of that. It looks terrible. But summer rot is typically something that no varieties that I'm aware of are going to have resistances to. But a lot of these other ones are nothing to play with as well. So be mindful. If you're seeing your tree have any cues of unhealthiness. So I will move forward now in the name of time. I think I need to be conscious of not using up too much time, but I want to talk about peaches. I talked about apples and peaches. Peaches are stone fruit. They grow a little bit differently, so we'll talk about a few different types of tree today. But so general needs of a peach tree. There are, like apple trees, a lot of problems in this region. A lot of people grow them. So they're susceptible hosts for a lot of things. Uh, Aphids from the garden to, I see brown rot a lot. There are certainly a lot of problems, but IPM, I kind of group these together with apples because both of them, in addition to pears, require a good integrated pest management plan as well as some pesticide use. Pesticide pesticide does not always mean synthetic, restricted use pesticide. There are more than one way to kill a bug, but oftentimes it's the heavy stuff that is required if you've got an orchard. Sun and well-drained soil are huge. Um, Otherwise, the tree is really going to have a hard time. Right tree, right place is a good rule. And then give it a couple of years and you'll, depending on the variety, start having fruit. They're not like they don't have the most longevity of any fruit tree, but I mean, 15 years considering a lot of changing environmental conditions and things like that, 15 years is a fair bet for a peach tree. Um, Considering how a peach tree orchard is laid out, um, peaches aren't going to be grown on dwarfing or, on rootstocks that limit the size of the mature plant. So spacing them out effectively is important. Sunlight is arguably the greatest asset to these plants, and when you've got big trees, maybe you need to space them out a little farther apart so that they're not preventing one another from getting sunlight. 20 or so feet apart is common for peach trees, but if you got a big variety or they grow really well in your area, maybe you push them a couple more feet apart. North to south, always important. Nematodes can be fairly problematic and common with peach trees. So testing before you plant is a good practice, really with anything, but be mindful of it if you're a peach grower. And then low-lying areas, if the soil's wet or too sticky or peaches like well drained soil. So be mindful of that. A handful of varieties. Peaches, the characteristics of the fruit are as capable of being different as the characteristics of the trees themselves. Time of fruit maturation, the texture of the flesh, the color of the fruit, the cold hardiness of the plant. I like this picture because you can see, the leaves and the flesh and the skin and the pit all at the same time. But these are all varieties of peaches that you can grow here or not too far from here. Let me move forward. Oh, I'm eating up time. I got to be smart here. I'll be quick with these last few about peaches. So peach trees, unlike apple trees, and unlike pear trees, usually you want to train through pruning them to be with an open center. You want space and airflow right in the middle of that tree. So during the time of planting, you're going to want to cut the head, the main center portion of that tree back to where it is about 2 feet tall. This is going to encourage the scaffolds, the fruit-bearing branches, to form at spaces on the trunk that are going to create a mature tree that's capable of holding the weight of a bunch of fruit. At about a year after it's been in the ground, you want to be mindful of which branches are those scaffolds. And another big important thing to remember is that usually peaches are going to come on the young, fresh growth of the plant. So being mindful to not over prune your plant and get rid of the areas where it might be producing fruit, or don't prune it at the wrong time. Which we can always talk about that at greater length too. So considering, let me see, can we move forward? I want to talk about some of the pests of a peach tree. It's really important to closely monitor your fruit trees for pests. Scale is a common one. Peach tree borers are pretty common, and they're hard to spot. They're easy to be undetected, but can really kind of hurt your crops. This picture here is Japanese beetles, which we probably all don't like those. But in order to get rid of some of the major peach tree pests, there are, you can use some type of horticultural oils, dormant oil. You can use some pyrethroids, excuse me. It's a little more of an intense chemical. So there are a variety of options. Now, considering, I want to slide forward to consider some of the diseases that could be vectored by or go alongside some of those peach tree pests, which, like a lot of the major apple tree diseases, moisture and humidity and things like that can really promote fungal problems. So brown rot is huge. It's awful. Peach scab is a common one, really makes the trees ugly, or the fruit ugly. That's peach scab in that picture. And they're all treated in generally different ways, but they are also all fungi. So I am conscious that I've used up a little bit more than my fair share of time, but I do want to say that there are some commonalities and some differences between things like apple trees and pear trees. So I look forward to Melissa explaining some of those differences. So if you want to take it away, that's all I got.
All right, thanks, John. Yeah, John covered a lot of the things that I was going to touch on, so I'll move a little more quickly through my slides. I think they complement each other really well. So the fig trees, talking about planting, we see again and again, good drainage. That means that you don't have standing water at the site after a rain event. Full sun, slightly acidic soil. Figs are self-fruiting, so it's not really a fruit that you're seeing, it's actually an inverted flower. It's a fleshy receptacle and the fruits are actually inside. So it doesn't need a pollinator buddy. You want to choose the correct variety for where you are, and we'll talk about varieties in just a second because that will help with your disease resistance. A lot of the fruit trees need routine pesticide spraying, but figs do not. They're actually the easiest to grow organically. This is a nice article I found from Jessica Strickland. She is the horticultural agent in Wayne County, and she wrote this article about fig trees in your garden just this January. So let's talk a little bit about variety. There are 3 general fig flavor profiles. There's the sugar with the brown skin, and the berry with the more darker black skin, and then the honey flavor. So I learned a lot about fig varieties setting up for this webinar. I want to show you quickly this site. This is Lazy Dog Farm. They're in southern Georgia, and they explain the different the flavor profiles. And then they also sell figs. It's not an advertisement for Lazy Dog Farms. They just do a really good job of profiling the different kinds of figs that you can plant. And then they have all the different varieties. And if you click on, one of the varieties, they tell you its flavor profile, its fruit size, days to fruiting, that sort of thing. So I think and they're in southern Georgia. So I think it's a really helpful site. There's also this link here to an Almost Eden webpage, Figs of the Southeast. It talks about some more common ones like Celeste and brown turkey that we grow here. Moving on to fig planting. Again, we're going to be planting in late fall, early winter when things are dormant. Well-drained, high organic matter soil. You do not fertilize when you plant the tree. You want to have about 10 feet between trees. Figs are something that are really easy to control the height of fig trees. They have really deep roots. You want to plant away from a building if you can, because they can get 30 feet tall. So planting a fig in the ground, we're going to dig a hole that's twice as wide as our root ball here. If there's any long roots that are outside of the hole, you want to cut those off. You don't want to leave roots that are curled around the root ball when you plant, because those run the risk of growing in that curved fashion and then strangling the trunk as it grows. So you're going to cut off any damaged roots, short and long ones. Like John said, so when you're planting a grafted tree, you want to make sure that union is at least 2 inches above the soil, because you don't want the rootstock to root. And you also want to keep that area clean. Then you're going to fill the hole with native soil. Don't pack it and water it well. You can also plant a fig in a pot. There are dwarf varieties that you can plant in a pot, but it's also really easy to manage the height of any fig tree. So if you wanted a different variety that's not a dwarf variety and wanted to plant it in a pot, you can do that too. You want to make sure you choose a lightweight pot, because you're going to be moving it inside in the winter to a climate-controlled environment like a garage. Choose a pot that isn't more than twice the size of the pot that it came in. It's better to do that and up pot later. You can find pots on wheels, or maybe a tray with wheels that you can put the pot on. Good drainage is really important. When I had a fig in a pot, I was told to drill holes like towards a quarter of a way up from the bottom, so that I watered until water drained out of those holes. Figs are naturally drought tolerant, but you have to be cognizant of the fact that pots will dry out a lot quicker than an in-ground fig. You can stick your finger in the pot if it's dry 2 inches down. You want to water. Watch it during the summer when it's really hot. You will need to fertilize a fig that's in a pot. So you can fertilize in the early spring when fruiting is going to begin, and then also in the midsummer. A slow release fertilizer is a really good option. And then we're going to prune in late winter to control size. So like we said, we're going to have some consistent watering the first year until it's established. The in-ground fig trees might never need any fertilizer. If you're seeing less than 12 inches of growth in a year, then you can add some fertilizer to your in-ground fig. You want to split the application of nitrogen, some in the spring and then some later in the summer. Mulching is always good around the tree to conserve moisture, and then minimal pruning during the dormant season. Like I said, they're easy to grow organically. If you have an abundant amount of figs in the beginning, you can take off some of those smaller figs, and that encourages larger fig growth. Okay, so we talked about pruning really just for plant health. If you don't prune a fig tree, it's going to be bushy. You can establish a single trunk or several well-spaced leaders when you're doing dormant pruning. You're removing dead wood, any crossovers, cutting back really big branches. There are some pests of figs, and there's a link here for cooperative extension for carpenter worm and tree borer. These are moths that will lay eggs at the base of the tree. So the best thing you can do is protect that base of the tree so that the moths don't lay eggs. Mulch, a netting, a wrap to stop the egg laying. And then fig rust is a big one. So Lazy Dog Farm actually has a blog post on fig rust. In southern Georgia, they see it every year. It's just a way of life in the southeast when we have hot, humid weather during the summer. It is a fungus. You remove the material immediately. You can spray when they're dormant if you like, but they just sort of prune and deal with it. You want to remove any material before it sporulates. A bigger problem is root knot nematodes. So John mentioned them. These are tiny microscopic worms in the soil, and they suck on the roots and feed on the roots. The best thing you can do is get a soil test before you plant anything to make sure you don't have these root knot nematodes. You can use a nematicide if you like. If you do have them, try planting marigolds in the soil. They've been shown to suppress root knot nematode populations. Definitely get your soil tested. Anthracnose, which if you've been with us, we've talked about anthracnose with absolutely everything that we have grown. It's a fungal disease that you get the dark sunken spots on the leaves, and then it moves to the fruit, and fruit rots and drops. There's no cure for anthracnose. You want to make sure that you maintain those good cultural practices of pruning for airflow, sunlight. Don't water, top water, and leave wet leaves going into the evening. And then remove all the material. Let's talk about persimmons. So persimmons, Diospyros, food of the gods. There's two primary varieties that are grown here in the United States. The Diospyros Asian, Diospyros kaki, the Asian or Japanese persimmon, and two varieties, Haichia and Fuyu. And then Diospyros virginiana, which is our common persimmon or American persimmon. The Asian persimmon is commercially grown in the South, mainly in Florida. Most of them are grown in California commercially. These are larger fruits. They're monoecious. They are self-pollinating. You don't need two. They both like well-drained loamy soils, and both bloom in the spring and bear fruit in the fall. Now, the common persimmon is native to the East Coast, so it's more cold hardy. Has smaller fruit. This is a really large shade tree. And it's dioecious, needs both a male and a female flower. The American persimmon here, you can see it's a really large shade tree. This is a really important wildlife food plant, common to the Native to North American Southeast. They can be 30 to 80 feet tall. It's dioecious, so it needs needs two trees to pollinate to get fruit. Like I said, moist, well-drained, sandy soils, but it can tolerate a lot of conditions, really, and it does well in urban conditions. It's really slow growing. This is a tall tree. It can take 4 to 8 years to bloom, and then another 3 years to produce fruit. Both persimmons have beautiful fall foliage, the orange and reds of a persimmon. You can see here that, often the leaves will drop, but you'll still have the persimmons on the tree. So this is the Asian persimmon, the Fuyu variety, native to Eastern Africa. Eastern Asia and India. This is mostly what you see in the supermarket here. It's the non-astringent type, meaning if you eat it before it's totally ripe, it's not going to suck all the moisture out of your mouth. These are a lot smaller trees, 20 to 30 feet tall, mostly 20 feet tall. They thrive in the southeast North Carolina and the southern Piedmont, but they cannot tolerate cold temperatures. Full sun, loamy soil, slightly acidic. These are monoecious. They bloom in mid-April. These do not require annual pruning, just removing suckers or dead material. And this variety is mature when it's still tender to the touch, and it can be sliced or eaten raw. That's opposed to this Haichia variety, which looks like a Roma tomato. These are very astringent if they're not totally ripe. And when they're totally ripe, they're really soft and squishy, like cutting off the top and eating it with a spoon. These are often used in baking, whereas the Fuyu are the more sort of like a flattened beefsteak tomato. They can still be eaten while firm, but also when soft. Like I said, sliced and eaten raw. So planting persimmon, a little different than the others we talked about. Again, full sun, tolerate partial shade. You see persimmons a lot at the edges of open fields. The American variety is really big. You're going to want to plant those farther apart. Asian variety is smaller. You can plant them closer together. If you order a plant online, you're going to get a bare root. So you want to dig a hole big enough to accommodate the root system, cut off any really long roots. If you're going to a local nursery, you're going to get a potted tree. You want to dig a hole 4 times as wide as the root ball and twice as deep to accommodate all the roots. And then plant it at the same depth that it was in the pot and backfill with the original soil. Water well, don't fertilize, no pruning at planting. Something to note, the roots of a persimmon tree are often black. There's nothing wrong with it, but the roots might be black. Persimmons can also be grown in a pot if that's what you need to do. Make sure that the pot is not too big, but big enough to accommodate the root system. Really good drainage, so maybe use a potting mix, and then you're going to have to up pot later. Carrying, they need very little fertilizer. If you're getting less than 12 inches, you can add a balanced fertilizer, like 10-10-10 in the early spring when it's fruiting. You're just going to be doing corrective pruning to remove dead or diseased material or cut out any crossovers. And mulch is always a good idea. Pests and diseases, again, we have our friend anthracnose, leaf blight. You can use a copper spray, prune, good pruning practices. Too much fertilizer, you can get fruit drop for persimmons. There's persimmon psyllids, which are small insects that suck plant juices. You don't want to prune when the tree is growing because then you're going to get a lot of new tender growth that they really like. They can be suppressed with horticultural oils like neem oils. And these trees have a lot of beneficials, so you don't want to harm the beneficials, like insects like scales and fruit flies, like lacewings, minute pirate bugs, ladybugs. They have a lot of beneficials. So if you're near a natural environment, that's great. If you're in a more urban setting, think about planting some zinnias or sunflowers or buckwheat, something to make a nice home and entice these beneficial insects. All right, let's talk about pears quickly because I want to get to your question. So, this is one Pyrus calleriana that we don't want. This is the Bradford pear. It's invasive. It's pollinated by the flies, and it needs two varieties to pollinate. This is the small woody fruit. So we're not really interested in this pear. We're interested in the European pear or the common pear that's native to Europe and northern Iraq. Lots of different cultivars that vary in size and shape. Most often it's grafted onto a rootstock. Like John said, the rootstock is going to influence the mature size, any pest or disease resistance, and the time to fruiting. Most varieties are not self-fertile, so they're more productive if 2 varieties are planted. Needs sunlight, can take years to flower and bear fruit, and grown in zones 4 through 8. So really sort of coastal Virginia all the way to Texas and then all of the South. There's a nice cooperative extension link here to the common pear, things like Bosque, Anjou, and Bartlett. Asian pears, we also grow these, and you will see these in the supermarket. Let me advance my slide here. super crispy and juicy. These are tree ripened. You know, they don't get gritty like some of the other pears can. They have a really long shelf life. They are really sensitive to bruising, so you'll often see them in these little socks in the supermarket. These are smaller trees, dwarf trees. These peaches are delicious. I'm sorry, pears are delicious, can be eaten raw. We see the hosu, chojuru, and the sensheki. With they each have a different taste. I'm not going to get into it right now. But chilling hour is really important for pears. So, like we said, chilling hours are required for fruit trees to break dormancy. If the chilling hours aren't met, then you're going to get no flowers or few flowers or incomplete flowers. Either way, you're not going to get any fruit. So they vary by variety, but 200 to 800 hours. That can be 8 days to a month. So that'll influence which kind of variety, what you're going to plant. The Asian pear varieties in general have low chilling hour requirements. The Shinko and Kosu varieties, 400 to 500 hours. The European varieties, like the Kiefer and Kamis, also have low chilling hour requirements. But the Anjou and the Bosc and the Red Bartlett have higher requirements. I'm really interested to see now that with climate change and our winters are so mild, if the chilling hours are not meeting, if we're not meeting the requirements, if that's changing here in North Carolina. Planting a pear tree, again, full sun. Don't add fertilizer, enough hole deep enough to accommodate the root ball, twice as wide. You might be waiting 4 to 6 years for fruit production. And then caring, make sure it's watered well. Its planting is a great time to install a trunk guard so that the rodents, small children, voles are not hurting the trunk as it's growing. You can also stake it when you plant it. No fertilizer needed the first year. And then dormant planting. John talked a lot about pruning, so I'm going to skip this one. You know, if you want that quintessential pear-shaped tree, you're going to prune to 1 liter to create that balanced conical shape that we see here. So first year, you're going to choose a leader, prune out the other 2 competitors, and any crossovers. The second year in the spring, so this is the scaffolding that we're building, these equally spaced fruit-bearing limbs, and cutting out any crossovers and things that are too close together. And the third year here, we've got a nice strong leader, and this picture is from the University of Minnesota Cooperative Extension on growing pears, and then we're pruning for tree health here and airflow, cutting out these in the middle. Pests and diseases, much easier to grow than apples. Fire blight is something that you want to look at. It's a bacterial disease, so it likes the hot, humid environments here. You're going to want to prune out immediately any infected leaves. This is a picture of fire blight here. You know, follow good practices and clean your pruners between each cut. And you can choose a variety that has some resistance to fire blight. Okay, left time for questions. These are a big list of all our resources that we mentioned. I see that we have a lot of questions in the chat box. So here's our information. Yes, you can email us and get a copy of the slide deck if you like. I saw someone came in late and wanted to know if they could also have the slides going with the recording. John, if you've had a moment, maybe have you looked at some of the chat questions?
Yes, I have fielded a few of them, but there are certainly some other ones we can talk to. So thank you for everybody being so participatory in the chat, because that's what we're here for. So as far as things that were brought up in the last few minutes, we can kind of work our way back. Pine trees being a problem for figs.
Pine tree?
Yeah, that's not something I'm entirely aware of. If there are like some botanical properties that I don't think that the trees would not want to grow near each other. But figs do like sunlight and pine trees can grow tall.
Mm-hmm.
So my intuition would be you would not want to put fig trees in the area where a tall, like a loblolly might cast a shadow or something.
Mm-hmm.
But Devana, if you want to shoot one of us an email, I'm sure we could do a little bit of digging and follow up on that for you.
Yeah, good idea. I mean, figs don't need to be real tall, so, but I think the sunlight would be an issue.
Yeah. Oh, and somebody mentioned cedar apple rust. That could
Mhm.
certainly, that does affect pears, or sorry, somebody else mentioned pears as
Mhm.
well. So I'm thinking about that. So, a general principle that we really try to adhere to is ample airflow, and when we're talking about smaller scale, higher density plantings, maybe not as much with fruit trees, but the more densely you plant, the more problems you may have with pests or pathogens being passed along from one variety of plant to another. So in regard to transmission of cedar apple rust, that could potentially, I'm answering another question right now too, but um, I don't know about pine trees and figs. Um, Let's see. I'm gonna work my way back in the questions. And if anybody has anything, please feel free. Like you can unmute yourself if you want to. We wanna hear from folks here.
Yeah.
Um, I had a question about peach trees self-pollinating, which there are some varieties like apple trees, that there are some varieties that list themselves as self-pollinating. But from a reliability, efficiency, quality, quantity of fruit standpoint, um, you're limiting yourself in some of those things. But if you are trying to do it just on a small scale, maybe have a few peaches for yourself and your friends, looking into a self-pollinating peach tree could be a good idea. Um, what else we got?
Ambrosia beetle. I don't know anything about ambrosia beetle.
Um, I don't know much about the ambrosia beetle,
I-
Jessamine, but I would encourage you to, if you are in North Carolina, I would encourage you to talk to your local horticulture agent. Um, uh, Kind of horticultural management of pests within fruit trees is something that we do a lot of in county offices. So maybe reach out to your local extension agent, or if you don't have one, shoot me an email and I'll point you in the right direction.
I see someone asking about, so, I do know that most of the, well, I know that the figs and the pears and persimmons like slightly acidic soil. Someone's asking about maybe it's the fact that pine trees create too much of an acidic environment and not to mulch pine fruit trees with pine, if that's what they're talking about. Um, so yeah, I mean, pine can be really acidifying. I would choose a hardwood mulch to mulch with rather than pine, but I think growing, yeah, I mean, because pine trees are so large and create so much shade that locating fruit trees away from a pine, I think in general would be a good consideration.
Yeah, and their capacity to, or plants within that family to host different
Hmm.
pathogens that could also eventually make their ways to fruit trees. So that's not a specific thing that I've thought much about, but all common sense would point towards a bit of compartmentalization maybe between um pines and some of the things we've talked about. Um I
These
have
are
a
some good questions here. So we're just about out of time, but someone asked a question about spotted lanternflies damage fruit, other fruit, damaging fruit other than grapes. Um, I
you
don't
know
know if you know anything about that, John. My suggestion would be to go to NC State Extension and look up spotted lanternflies because I'm sure they have some really good information about spotted lanternflies. Do you have any information to add, John?
not not beyond the fact that they like fresh juicy fruit. They're gonna go grapes and a number of fruit trees, so they are a pest. But we're on such they're treating them like fire ants and avian flu. Like they're such a thing that is being watched for negative impact, that the specialists at the universities really just are scared of them across the board because of the detriment that they could be. But yeah, fruit trees, they could definitely be a problem for fruit trees. And I see that Kat Causey chimed in. Kat, glad to see you here. Thank you for your input. If Kat said it, then I would listen to what she has to say too. So if there is anything else, I know we got a couple of minutes, like please feel free and chime in, but check our email addresses, check our phone numbers, stay in touch. Melissa, is it okay if I plug my survey for 1 second?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So I got a lot of people here. We got 100 or so people in the audience. Anybody who is local to Durham County, where I work, or nearby, we just got 130 acres of land to use as an incubator farm. It's a big project that I'm working on. Ideally, we are focusing on people who have ambition to produce different food crops on a small scale. But all of the webinars that we teach are in regard to topics that will eventually be demonstrated on site. So we are conducting a survey. We all get surveyed all the time. We are conducting a survey essentially where if you are local to this area, you can give us input that will drastically affect how we choose to use the tons of resources that we have for this incubator farm. We're establishing a food processing facility. We're doing all this stuff. We want to hear from you. So that survey is unofficially closed. We essentially it ends unofficially yesterday, but it is open to people who might have some answers. It's kind of like we still really need your input, open until Thursday night. So I am putting the survey link in the chat right now. So anybody who is interested and you are local, please please fill this survey out. I would love to hear back from you. And sorry to take time to do that, but it is such an opportunity to influence local agriculture. So I am putting that survey in the chat right now. I was buying myself some time and rambling as I found it. But here we are. Let me see. So yes, thank you everyone for listening to my slight pitch right there, but we really are trying to promote local agriculture. So thanks everybody for listening.
Oh, sorry.
Love it. Participants only dropped a few while I was talking right there. So thanks everybody for listening. But yeah, send us emails if you're interested. You got a couple days to fill that survey out, and please consider attending our next webinar in a couple of months.
That's in April.
Oh yeah, I said a couple months, like a month out. So we hope you guys attend the next one as well. But that's all I got. Thank you so much all for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much. I will say that I think the next one is going to be a repeat, but with a lot of tweaking from our really, really popular one, maintenance of common summer vegetable crops last year that we had so many people. So we're going to be doing that one again. We're not just going to repeat it, but we're going to revisit a lot of the same information.
Yeah, we're always making tweaks for relevance and quality, and really just, you know, the success of what we do is based on how much you all get out of it. So we appreciate feedback, and we're very lucky to have such an awesome group of people to attend our events. So thank you. And also thank you to Cephs and to Melissa. Y'all are always a pleasure to work with.